And welcome, everybody. Hands-On Apologetics is great to be with you. You have now entered into Virgin Most Powerful's Apologetics Dojo. I am your sensei and all-around good guy, host, Gary Michuta. It's great to be with you. And welcome, folks. We are chatting with Master Apologist David Palm. And by the way, Dave, I want to say happy birthday.
Yes, thank you, Gary. It is my birthday today. Yep.
Well, it's your birthday, but we're getting the present. So... thank you for coming on. The Galileo affair is kind of the perfect storm. You have, the church still smarting from the Protestant Reformation. You have science slowly coming out of philosophy into experimental science. You have a Copernicus theory. And, of course, I think we should probably say a little bit about Galileo, because I think in the popular mind, everyone thinks of Galileo as a very quiet, humble scientist, sticks in his lab, wouldn't hurt a fly type person. But his personality is quite different, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he was definitely known as a gadfly. He had an inflated ego, and that's not to say that he wasn't a brilliant scientist, because he really was. But he was also just sort of a master debater, and so he would just destroy his opponents in personal debate, and he would do more than that. He would sort of rub their noses in it, right? And so he made a lot of enemies. And most notably there at the end, he made an enemy out of Urban VIII, who again had actually been, very he had been pretty open to these ideas, but ended up, kind of having a personal swipe taken at him and turned pretty radically against Galileo. That being said, there are any number of ways in which Galileo himself sort of gets a bad rap, and one of them that I think I had mentioned to you before is just that it's often said that he sort of attacked sacred scripture and the veracity of sacred scripture and was sort of opposing his view to the truthfulness of Scripture, and that is actually one of the myths. I have been impressed in my own reading of Galileo, particularly his correspondence, that he was actually very careful to uphold the truthfulness of Scripture, but he ended up really hewing to the principles that were laid out by primarily St. Thomas and St. Augustine, kind of twofold principles. One is that our particular interpretation of Scripture may need to give way in light of certain observations in the physical realm. And that sounds kind of radical, but it was laid out as early as St. Augustine, that we sometimes need to hold our own interpretations of Scripture a little bit loosely and be prepared to let them be molded. But the second is also extremely important, and that is that Scripture can speak of physical phenomena in terms of their appearances without making any particular pronouncement on, the physical reality behind that, right? And that's actually been enshrined as a principle by, most notably, Leo XIII in Providentissimus Deus.
Good. Well, hey, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, you mentioned some myths. Why don't we dive into some of the more popular myths?
Well, sure. So that was one of them that I had down.
Yeah.
Another myth that oftentimes is leveled, and this is kind of on the opposite side of the Galileo spectrum, is that Galileo really had demonstrated the superiority of his system scientifically, and that his opponents were basically just being anti-intellectual, anti-science, that kind of thing. And this is not true. When they said that his system, especially the two propositions that were looked at they called it absurd and false in philosophy, which again is according to natural philosophy or science. They still had good grounds to say that. And the three major things that Galileo had laid out, specifically retrograde motion of the planets, sunspots that he had discovered on the surface of the sun, and then the motions of the tides, none of those things are pointed to anymore as any kind of vindication of the Copernican system. I mean, ironically, all three of them are kind of big misses in terms of actually establishing the truthfulness of what he was insisting upon. And so, that being said, though, even though Galileo had not demonstrated his system scientifically or according to natural philosophy, it can also be said, in fairness, that his opponents did have a too strong attachment really to Aristotle's physics, right? And this was, the dominant physics of the day came through Aristotle, whose philosophy was brilliant, but his physics were really, really lacking. And, the late Father Stanley Yaki has said that, unfortunately, Aristotle's science is wrong in just about every aspect of it, and so Aristotle's physics would sort of impose paradigms on reality, so you'd say the heavenly objects have to be perfect spheres, and they have to go in perfect circles, right? And we only have 4 elements, and they sort of tend, the heavy ones, the earth, it tends to fall by its nature, and fire tends to rise by its nature, and that kind of thing. And so he sort of imposed these paradigms on reality, and then it became sort of an upset when observational science took us to the place that we began to see that, hey, these things don't go in perfect circles, and the heavenly bodies aren't perfect spheres, and that kind of thing. But that was only just starting to happen, and Galileo's opponents, I think, were sort of too wed to that Aristotelian physics.
Yeah, very good. Very good. Yeah. Well, how about this? How about Galileo was opposed because his system demoted the Earth from being the most important place in the universe? That is.
Yeah. So this is a really, really interesting one, Gary, and this just kind of blew my mind because you always kind of hear this notion that, the ancients thought that the Earth was the center of the universe, and that's true, but we kind of had this feeling like they thought it was the center because it was the most important thing, and that therefore when Galileo and Copernicus challenged that, it was sort of an affront to that particular view, and that is completely wrong. Now, if we get back to the physics of Aristotle, it's actually that the heaviest things fell in that system. The things that were sort of heavy, corrupt, coarse, those things fell, and those are things that are made up of Earth, of the 4 elements, right? The lighter elements would tend to go to the most perfect places, which were the heavenly realms, right? So it's really the opposite. The heavenly realms were the realms of perfection for them, and the Earth was actually a place of coarseness. So, for example, the Venerable Bede says, the Earth, I'm quoting here, lies in the center of the pole of the world like the heaviest body. It occupies among the created beings the humblest place. St. Thomas speaks of the earth as being the most ignoble of bodies in the universe. St. Albert the Great speaks of earth among the bodies as a fex, which is in Latin actually excrement or dung, right? So Professor Danielson, in a fantastic article called The Copernican Cliché, he says that in most medieval interpretation of Aristotle's and Ptolemy's cosmology, Earth's position at the center of the universe was taken not as evidence of its importance, but as grossness. In this view, the Earth appears as a universal pit, figuratively as well as literally the universe's low point. And so actually there was a Dominican theologian named Giovanni Maria Tolosani who actually condemned Copernicanism in part because he said, quote, Copernicus puts the indestructible sun in a place subject to destruction, end point. So it's a fascinating inversion of what they actually held. For them, the center was not a place of particular importance. It was actually a place of corruption, with the very center being the most wicked place, of course, which was hell.
Yeah, I was going to say that because, if you understand the world as a sphere, really what's at the center would be the underworld, right?
Exactly. So it wasn't until a couple of hundred years later, and it was really an argument advanced, essentially by atheists that started to say, oh, well, no, the Earth is insignificant and worthless because it's not at the center of the universe anymore. The ancients or the medievals would just never have thought it that way, and nobody brought that up as an opposition point to Galileo.
Wow. Yeah, so that's, it kind of spawns into yet another no popery, canard that the Earth is the center and most important is actually, that's just a spin-off of an even bigger myth.
Exactly. It's kind of that corollary to the whole flat Earth thing, where they say, oh, the ancients all believed in a flat Earth, ha, 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 and St. Thomas even then says, every educated person knows that the Earth is round.
Oh, very good. We're talking with Master Apologist David Palm about the Galileo Affair. More to come on the other side of the break. Stay tuned.
Virgin Most Powerful Radio, sharing the gospel with clarity and charity.